right? So it's a very different time period from what we've been discussing up to now. Up to now, we've been discussing the first century of Muslim history. In the first century of Muslim history, there were a lot of victories. The golden age of Islam was just beginning. Now we jump ahead 600 years later, where the golden age, or rather the first golden age, is over. And the Muslim empire is starting to show signs of weakness. It's starting to show cracks. And something happens at this time which may be the single worst genocide in the history of Islam. Something far darker and far worse than even what's happening today. And that is the rise of the Mongols. Right? The rise of the Mongols. So who were the Mongols? The Mongols were a bunch of nomadic tribes living in Mongolia. They were not a civilization. They were not a superpower. They weren't even a city or a town. They were a bunch of shepherds who would take care of the animals and live in tents. And they were disunited and they were fighting with each other. So nobody ever looked at them and thought that a threat to our empire will come from this side of the world. Right? They were seen as a backwards people who, just focus on themselves. But something happened about 800 years ago that completely changes the tide of history. And what happens is that amongst the Mongols, a man rises up by the name of Genghis Khan. Right? Genghis Khan, or as some people mispronounce his name, Genghis Khan. Right? It's actually Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan, he unites the Mongols behind him. He kind of gives himself almost like a messiah type of personality, where he's like the savior of his people. And they unite behind him and they become one community. And he has some wars with the Chinese, the immediate neighbors of the Mongols, and history may have been restricted to just Mongols versus Chinese if it wasn't for something really, really stupid that the Muslims did at that time. Now, so what happens is that Genghis Khan he sends an ambassador to the Muslims in Samarkand to basically set up a peace treaty between the Mongols and the Muslims. So in human history, before the modern world, there were no set borders, right? There's always war between nations. Peace treaties are what kept nations at peace with each other. So the Mongols wanted a peace treaty with the Muslims. And they sent a message to Samarkand. Samarkand at that time is a Muslim empire in that part of the world that today is like Uzbekistan and the surrounding areas. It's an empire we don't know much about because, as you'll see, its history was kind of wiped out. So the ruler of Samarkand is very rude to the ambassador or the emissary of the Mongols. And he basically rejects them, he betrays them, he kills some people who he shouldn't have killed, and he basically humiliates the Mongols to show, maybe to the show of power, that we are the Muslims, we're the world superpower, you're a bunch of barbarians, we don't care about you. And so basically, a very arrogant act, this Muslim king, he sets off the rage of Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan then goes on a series of battles and wars, or rather just a series of genocides, basically to take revenge for what for the humiliation the Muslims put him through. And if you don't know who Genghis Khan was, this was a man who, his main weapon of war was terror. His main weapon of war was psychological terror. He would basically beat people to fear. He carried like an aura with him, a presence with him, that this is the end times and he's the punishment of God and there's nothing you can do about it. And part of his terror tactics was when he would invade a city, he would kill everybody. Everybody. Man, woman, child, even the animals. And this would cause terror in all the nearby cities. And so he invades Samarkand and he completely destroys this empire, this great Muslim empire that existed at the time. He completely wipes it out. And a very bizarre incident takes place when he takes over the capital of Samarkand. He goes into the masjid and he stands on the mimbar and he delivers a khutbah. This is not a Muslim. This is a tyrant who is conquering the Muslim world. He stands up and he delivers the khutbah and he tells the Muslims, I am Allah's punishment to you for all of your sins. And they say that the Muslims at that time were so deep into sin and so deep into evil that they felt they deserved punishment. And they did nothing to resist him. And so he begins to wipe out land upon land. And the amount of conquests that the Mongols have in this period of time is unmatched in human history. They basically bulldoze all of Asia, right? China, India, Samarkand, Iraq, Russia. They just take over large portions of the world. Nobody's safe. They defeat the Chinese, they defeat the Indians, they defeat the Russians, they defeat the Crusaders, they defeat the Muslims. And then one of the single most tragic genocides in the history of Islam takes place. The Mongols, after the time of Genghis Khan, so what happens is Genghis Khan dies very young, undefeated, right? And today we don't know where he's buried with all his treasure. And his empire is split into a bunch of mini empires amongst his sons and his grandsons. One of his grandsons, Hulagu Khan, he sets his sight on the capital of the world at that time, Baghdad. So Baghdad was built by the Muslims in the 2nd century in Iraq to be the capital of the Abbasid Empire. And over a 500-year period, it grew into the most powerful city in the entire world. Baghdad at that time was like the New York of our times. It was a huge, massive city with over 1 million people. 1 million people at that time is a lot for a city, right? Nowadays it doesn't seem like much, but talking about 800 years ago, 1 million people living in one city is actually unbelievable for that time. It's a massive city, it's a center of learning. Many of the most important discoveries in human history take place in the city, like the discovery of algebra. It is a place that's considered the beacon of civilization. It's also considered untouchable. It had a very strong security system. The whole city is designed like a circle with walls all around it and moats around it and guards on all the walls. But one of the biggest weaknesses of the Muslims is that we are our own worst enemies. And so one of the Muslims living in Baghdad, a high-ranking official, the Mongols offer him safety and protection if he lets them into Baghdad and shows them the weak spots. And in a moment of weakness that causes devastating impact for the Ummah, this man betrays the Muslims and the Mongols enter Baghdad and they completely destroy the city. Completely destroy the city. A genocide takes place to such an extent that some historians say 1 million people were massacred in this genocide. 1 million people in Baghdad. The whole city is destroyed. The libraries are destroyed. Many books written in the first 600 years of Muslim history are extinct because of what happened in Baghdad. Many great scholars were destroyed. And the Abbasid Khalifa is killed and executed in front of his people. And the Khilafat comes to an end. Now pause, I want you to think here about the parallels. At the time of the Mongols, the Khilafat is abolished. At our time, the Khilafat is abolished. In the time of the Mongols, the Muslims are split into a bunch of mini kingdoms. Today the Muslims are split into a bunch of mini kingdoms. In the time of the Mongols, the Muslims are witnessing a genocide and they can't do anything about it. In our times, the Muslims are witnessing a genocide and we can't do anything about it. In the time of the Mongols, people thought Qiyamah is close, the world is ending. Today everyone thinks Qiyamah is close, the world is ending. My point is that history repeats itself. And what happens next should give us hope. So the Mongols, they continue to take over the Muslim lands. And many of the Muslims don't resist it because they honestly thought the world was ending. In fact, if you read any books written at that time, they are described as Yajud and Majud. That the Muslim at that time literally thought that this is Yajud and Majud, this is Gog and Magog, the world's ending, it's over, there's no more Khalifa, there's no more Islam, we're all going to die. Right? This is what they thought. But it was the will of Allah that the Muslim world will endure. And a very small kingdom, really a very small and weak kingdom, known as the Mamluk Empire, resists the Mongols. So the Mamluks, they have their own fascinating history that we don't have time to go into. But they were European Muslim slaves living in Egypt, who somehow became the rulers of Egypt. It's interesting that in the Muslim world, the slaves were given such freedoms as slaves that they actually became rulers of empires. And the main leader of the Mamluks was actually someone who was enslaved by the Mongols. He spoke their language, he understood their culture, he knew their mindset. And he's now the leader of an army fighting the Mongols, a Muslim leader fighting the Mongols. And so, on the 25th of Ramadan, in the year 658 AH, coinciding with the 3rd of September 1260 CE, the army of the Mamluks meets the army of the Mongols in a plain or a desert known as Ain Jalut. Ain Jalut, the valley of Goliath. The valley of Goliath, because it is said it is this very same area where David defeated Goliath. And so symbolically, in the exact place where they say that David defeated Goliath, the Muslims faced the Goliath of their times. And in a miracle of miracles, the army of the Mamluks are successful and they defeat the army of Gulab Khan. And this has a ripple effect throughout the world history. Why? Because up until that battle, people thought that the Mongols were supernatural. People thought that the Mongols, there's something different about them, they cannot be defeated. The Mamluks defeating the Mongols led to a series of battles where they continued to defeat them. But it also led to other people rising up and fighting the Mongols as well, including the Christians. So the Christians, the Crusaders, they thought that the Mongols are just going to wipe them out. They thought these people were undefeatable. When they see the Mamluks winning a battle, they also start to rise up and they start to fight back. And so the Muslim victory on the 25th of Ramadan in the year 658 AH is a turning point in history. Because several things happened in the aftermath of this battle that completely changed the tide of Muslim history. Again, I want us to think about this in terms of where we are today. They were at the point where they thought the world was ending. They were at the point where the Khilafat was abolished. They were at the point where the Muslims were facing a genocide. They were at a point where there seemed to be no hope. Yet with one victory, the momentum changes in their favor. And then the Mamluk Empire endures. And it remains in charge of that part of the world, including Palestine and Makkah and Medina, and it remains in charge, at least of Egypt, right until the time of Napoleon, when Napoleon defeats them. So they remain there for a long time. At the same time, several other things happen as a ripple effect of this. The most miraculous of them is that some of the Mongols, including some of the grandchildren of Genghis Khan, convert to Islam. And so now the Mongols turn on each other and they fight each other. And now we have Mongols fighting jihad against other Mongols to take back the Muslim lands. And from these descendants of the Mongols come the great Muslim empires. The most famous one relevant to us is the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was the Mongol Muslim empire in India. And under Mughal rule, India became one of the wealthiest countries in the entire world. That's why the British invaded it. They wanted the wealth of the Mongols. Right? For us today, we can't actually imagine India to be like the most wealthiest and developed country in the world. But that's how it was before the British colonized it and stole everything. The Mongols, they convert to Islam, they grow into a mighty empire themselves. A third amazing thing that happens at this point is in a distant land, far away from Egypt, in what is today modern-day Turkey, in that part of the land, a group of nomads, they realize that the Mongols can't be defeated. And so they form a small town. You may have heard of Ertugrul, right? He and his warriors, they band together, they form a small town, they fight jihad against the Mongols and the Crusaders. And then his son Usman establishes a small little kingdom of about 5 or 6 cities. And they continue to expand, fighting the Mongols, fighting the Crusaders. And they grow over a few hundred years into a mighty empire. And the Muslims experience a golden age for the second time. Pause and think about this. 800 years ago, Muslims thought the world was ending. The Khilafat is over, it's never coming back, we all gonna die. 300 years later, the Muslims are experiencing another golden age, with mighty empires all over the world. Today, we are in a similar position to what the Muslims were like at the time of the Mongols. And many people think the world is ending, and they think there's no hope, there's no point, we shouldn't do anything. I say, there is always hope. I say, just as in that Ramadan, the tide turned in the favor of the Muslims, and out of nowhere, new Muslim kingdoms came up, then new Muslim golden ages came about, and the Muslims endured for another 700 years. This empire started by Usman in the 600s, in the time of the Mongols. Do you know when it ended? It ended in 1924, exactly 100 years ago. That's how long it endured for. So who are we to say the world is ending? Only Allah knows when the world will end. It could end tomorrow, it could end 1,000 years from now. Nobody knows. It's not our business to focus on the end times and to use a doom and gloom mindset to avoid taking action. We should be people of optimism, we should be people of hope, and the battle of Ain Jalut and the miraculous victory of the Mamluks against the Mongols should give us hope that in our lifetime something similar could happen in Gaza, something similar could happen for the Muslims of Palestine, something similar could happen for the Ummah to turn the tide back in our favor. Because really, we are actually in a better position today than the Muslims were at that time. We are more powerful today than the Muslims were at that time. We have more hope today, we have more resources than they had at that time. And if they were able to turn the tide against a force like the Mongols, when everything seemed against them, and establish new empires, and go on to dominate the world for another 700 years, who are we to say that it's all over and everything's going to end in our time? We must continue moving forward with hope. We should never lose hope in the mercy of Allah. We should never lose hope in the victory of Allah. We should never lose hope in Islam returning to a position of power. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So we have just one more victory in the month of Ramadan to discuss, and we'll discuss it next week. And I left that one for last because that's a story about a point in our history when Muslims lost Palestine, when they lost Jerusalem, and how they won it back in the month of Ramadan. So very relevant again to what the Muslim world is facing today, and inshallah we will discuss that in next week's khutbah. But I want to end today with a separate reminder on a separate topic, and that is that we're just a night away from entering the last 10 nights of Ramadan. And I know we are very distracted with what's going on in terms of global politics and in terms of the genocide, and that should be priority. We should continue to make dua and boycott and do whatever is in our power to turn the tide in Muslims' favor. But at the same time, we also should be increasing our ibadat for the last 10 nights. You know, when you think about the Battle of Ain Jalut, it took place on the 25th of Ramadan. That means it was one of the odd nights. You know, a night when we are sitting and doing ibadat and they were preparing for battle. And they were in a state of survival. Alhamdulillah, Allah has given us a lot of privileges, and He has given us a lot of luxury, and He has given us a lot of things that He has not given others. Let us take advantage of these last 10 nights. It is a time to worship Allah, it is a time to earn the forgiveness of Allah, it is a time when du'as are answered. It is a time when du'as are answered, and so you should be making dua for the people of Palestine, you should be making dua for yourself, for your family, for our community, for our country, for everyone in the Muslim world. Use this time to ask Allah. These last 10 nights, let us sleep less and pray more. Let us spend less time entertaining ourselves and more time calling out to Allah. And remember that even though we don't know which of these 10 nights is Laylatul Qadr, the wisdom behind that is that we spend all 10 nights in Ibadat. That's the wisdom behind it. So we spend all 10 nights in Ibadah. And remember that the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever spends the night of Laylatul Qadr in the worship of Allah, all of their sins are forgiven. And which of us don't want our sins to be forgiven? So let us continue to worship Allah properly, and let us gear up and take it to the next level as we enter the last 10 nights. These are the most important nights of the year. Let us make special effort in these last 10 nights to increase our Quranic recitation, increase our tahajjud, increase our dua, and to increase the quality of our fasting, so that inshallah this Ramadan will be a means of spiritual upliftment for us, of our du'as being answered, and also for turning the tide in favor of the Muslims. And finally, a reminder to please spend the last 10 nights making dua for all of the oppressed Muslims in the world, wherever they are, especially the people of Gaza, but not only the people of Gaza. I know Gaza is closest to our hearts because of Jerusalem and its high place, and because it's centered in the news, but there are many other parts of the world where Muslims are being oppressed as well. A lot of it goes under the radar, a lot of it is not on the news, right? There are situations nobody's talking about, like what's going on in India. India is also heading towards a genocide. All the signs are there. No one's talking about it, no one's doing anything about it. For many of us, this is our ancestral land. We have family there still who could be in danger. We should be making dua for them. We should be doing what we can to raise awareness of the situation, to do what we can to try and stop something from happening before it happens. Our problem nowadays is we wait for something to happen and then we react. No, if we see the signs that something's happening, we should strategize to try and stop it. So there are many parts of the Muslim world where Muslims are being oppressed, and we need to do what we can for them, the very minimum of which is dua. So please make dua for the oppressed Muslims all over the world, that Allah frees them and grants a return of power to Islam so that Muslims can live in peace and experience peace and justice, and that these trials that the Ummah has experienced over the past 100 years can come to an end. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant victory to the Mujahideen in Palestine. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect the oppressed and the weak wherever they are. اللهم انصر مجاهدنا في فلسطين، انصر المستضعفين في فلسطين، اللهم انصر المستضعفين في كل مكان. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. سبحان ربك العزة يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. أقم الصلاة.